Welcome to this event on how the Labour Party will reform social security and support more people into good work. We've got a great panel here today. First of all, I'll just give a bit of a preamble. So across the country, people are trying to make ends meet, build financial security, and pursue their aspirations. But in a vicious cycle of snakes and ladders, many are being pulled down into poverty and finding it hard to get into good, sustainable work. Our employment support services are characterised by an any-job model of generic advice underpinned by a punitive sanctions regime. Jobs that offer autonomy, flexibility, scope for progression, social support, and strong terms and conditions don't simply offer a route out of poverty. They can form a key part of our identity and sense of belonging. But large numbers of people face structural barriers to entering and staying in work, and too many jobs across the UK don't offer these fundamental elements of quality employment. This is contributing to a low-pay, low-productivity economy. This new government has a significant opportunity to set a new course towards rising living standards and falling poverty and hardship, and better employment and work. So I'll just briefly introduce the panel members now. So first we've got Matthew Patrick, MP for Wirral West. Hi. Hello. We've got, you're all over the place. Tom Pollard, Head of Social Policy at the New Economics Foundation. We've then got Sarah Lambert, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Gingerbread. We've got Faith Angwet, single parent with experience of universal credit. I'm going to talk about the actual experience of universal credit on the ground. And Professor Ashwin Kumar, Director of Research and Policy at IPPR. Hi. So it will basically be over to my speakers, and speaking first will be Matthew Patrick. Matthew.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the IPPR for putting on this event. I'm delighted to be invited to join the panel today. I think in this moment I have two roles. One, to describe as a politician what my constituents feel and need from a social security system, and to explain what this government is already doing to make improvements. But firstly, and I know it's a bit of a watchword of our conference, it's important to talk about our inheritance. If we think back to the 5 giants identified by Beveridge, as a diagnosis, I think it still stands up to today, and the Tories' welfare system doesn't tackle any of them well. Want, or need, as I at least see it. Poverty for working-age non-parents and children especially has increased massively in the last 14 years. In fact, 45% of children in larger families are in relative poverty. And you can see that not just from stats, but I always think it's important to think about what you see in your daily life. And you see the increased need in our supermarkets for food banks, increased poverty in all walks of life. So I think on point 1, on want, as Beveridge described it, we can see that the Conservatives have failed us. On disease, or as I would see it, health and waiting lists, I probably don't need to remind any of you the dire situation that our NHS has found itself in, waiting times at a record level. And we need to do so much more because more people now are on sickness-related benefits than ever before. And it's not just the stats. I think back now to conversations I had on the campaign trail and since of people waiting, sometimes years, for that all-important operation. And I realised, and I know all of you will as well, what that does to someone, how that makes them feel, what stress it adds to them and their life, which makes things much worse, and to their family. Thirdly, Beveridge identified ignorance, which I see as the skills gap. And I think you can see, as Henry remarked, we have a DWP now focused far more on how it can punish people, what sanctions it can impose, than on how it can support people into acquiring the right skills and getting a good job. And I want us to focus on that as well. Fourth was squalor, and I think we see it in our housing crisis, 150,000 children in temporary accommodation. Homelessness at record levels. Again, you don't need to see the stats, you see it when you walk through your high streets. And idleness, which I would guess would be underemployment and economic inactivity. The stat of 1 in 8 young people not in education, employment or training is shocking. And I think we have huge amounts of skills in our country that are underutilised, and that's not good for individuals and it's not good for our country. And I don't know if you've heard, I don't know if anyone in a conference has mentioned this, but the government did overspend this year by £22 billion. And I know you've heard that. And I make that point quite seriously and deliberately, because to fix this mess, we can't want that stuff to have gone away. We have to address at root cause. And I think we saw in Rachel Reeves' speech today the efforts that we're going to take to do that. Because for over a decade now, we haven't seen wage growth. That basic deal, that if people in ordinary jobs worked hard, that things will get a little bit easier, has broken. And it's more than just broken public services and a social security system not fit for purpose. There is an economy on its knees. It's in crisis. You can't have a social security, good social security, without a good job market. So I believe in aspiration, and I think people want to earn more and improve their lot for them and for their loved ones. And I believe the labour market is the route, the best route and driver of social justice. The best way to help a family in poverty is with a good, well-paid and secure job. And for too long, people have been trapped in dead-end jobs with awful pay. And the Job Centre and DWP has failed them. And that has to change. So that's our gloomy inheritance, and now on to the good things we're going to do. What can we do as a government to improve things? Some of this will take time. One, making more good jobs. So making work pay, banning those exploitative zero-hour contracts, banning fire and rehire, enshrining basic rights for all workers. This is important in our task to make more good jobs. It means tackling low pay and the blight of underemployment. It doesn't matter what your hourly wage is if you can only get a handful of them. Secondly, we need to increase employment. We're going to review universal credit and try to make sure work pays and helps people. There will be a massive overhaul of job centres, shifting away from that punitive basis, where when someone walks in, your assumption is that they're somehow trying to do anything but get a job, and it's your job to catch them out. Well, I don't know about you, but if I walk into a room and people are expecting me to fail, or they're thinking the worst of me, I'm not performing well, I'm not feeling good. And I also think if you want to put someone in a situation where they can't get a good job, you want to crush their morale and crush their self-esteem, and I think too often that's happened. A job centre shouldn't be a bad place to go where you get assessed and sanctioned. It should be a supportive environment. Tackling illness, I mentioned the NHS waiting lists, so I won't go into that again, but we need to clear that backlog, and we're making investments to do so. And I think we're also making those preventative measures that are so important about introducing the next generation as a completely smoke-free generation. These are important steps to improving health and tackling illness. And fourth, delivering economic growth. Easy to say, but harder to do. We've invested already in a national wealth fund, so we can increase investment. And that's so important for so many walks of life. We see under the Tories, it went from about 2.5 years to approve national infrastructure development. It's gone to over 4 years now. So it hasn't happened, it's stalled, and I think we're all failed for it. And the fiscal stability, we have to deliver, because we can't be in a situation again where a mini budget comes forward and crashes our economy, and we see that ticker on our pound going down second after second after second. And that's why I think the stability that Rachel Reeves mentions, that commitment that this government has made on the campaign trail, which comes right through now into government, which is about being prudent with finances, just changing how we do things, is so important. So in conclusion, I think the social security is in a mess, but we can and we must fix it. And I know that change will take time, as I said before, but my belief is Labour governments have done this before, and we can do it again. Change has begun, and for every minute of this Labour government, we will be determined to deliver change. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Some good scene-setting stuff.
Thank you.
Tom, over to you. You've done lots of work in this area on employment support.
Yes.
What should the government be doing about it?
So I work at the New Economics Foundation, one of the leading progressive think tanks. Other progressive think tanks are available, I've heard.
So I'm told.
And we've been doing a lot of work around thinking about how the social security system interacts with the labour market. And traditionally, I think the benefit system is kind of seen as a kind of repository for where the labour market's going wrong, and there's not been enough focus on the positive role that social security could play in promoting and supporting better work. So I'll talk about three kind of interconnected problems from our perspective. One is that for many people, and particularly those who face greater barriers to work, whether that's because of health and disability or caring responsibilities or other factors, the system not only fails to support them into work, let alone good work, but actively kind of pushes them away from feeling they can engage confidently and comfortably with employment support. The second thing I'll touch on is that where people do move from benefits into work, it does tend to be more low paid, poor quality, insecure work with little prospect for progression. And actually, in many ways, the social security system has been propping that up rather than challenging it. And then finally, I think it's important to think about the adequacy of benefits within this debate, and too often whether or not benefits are adequate is kind of seen primarily just in terms of whether people's needs are being met, which is, of course, is critical, but it has another role to play in terms of the impact it has on someone's ability to return to work for a couple of reasons. One is kind of their health and well-being, and I think the extent to which people are living in poverty because of inadequate benefits is having a genuine impact on people's ability to then return to work and to think about what that would look like. But also it undermines people's kind of bargaining power in the labour market. If they're getting paid a very low rate of benefit, then there's very little upward pressure. So I'll talk about each of these quickly. First of all, that question around the quality of engagement in the system. So all the work I've done in this space, and I spent some time at DWP advising around mental health, and then I've since worked as a mental health social worker in the NHS, and I focused a lot on the importance of a trusting relationship. So if you look at kind of any helping relationship across a whole bunch of services, like the quality of that relationship and the level of trust and rapport is basically the key determining factor as to whether you get good outcomes. And that's particularly true for people who face additional barriers. But the social security system has been so focused on ensuring compliance, and it's seen a kind of strict and prescriptive approach to conditionality as essential to ensure a kind of minimum floor of compliance. And what's been missed in that debate is that actually you also create a ceiling on the quality of engagement by doing that. And so many people who could benefit from support, I'm thinking about people who are thought of as like economically inactive here, seek refuge from conditionality and seek refuge from the DWP-led system rather than feeling it's something they can positively engage with. And we've done research at NEF about how, in part, that's been driven by a perception that the public demands this kind of strict and prescriptive approach to conditionality. And actually, when we engage with the public, both through polling, but particularly through focus groups, people get that there's a trade-off here between an approach that focuses on compliance and one that is focusing more on engagement, and you have to balance those two things. And people totally understood that there's a case for saying, well, let's try and push conditionality into the background a bit more in order to achieve better outcomes. Secondly, then, the quality of work people do move into. And I think partly because of conditionality, but partly because of low benefit rates as well, and a kind of culture of low expectations, people do tend to move into kind of poorer quality work. And obviously, partly that's related to the fact that people who are going to the job centre will often have lower levels of experience and qualification. But I think we could be doing a lot more to use the job centre to kind of be propelling people into better jobs. And Katie Jones at MMU in Manchester does some really interesting work looking at the fact that employers just don't, well, a lot of employers don't see the job centre as somewhere you'd go to try and recruit someone who's like a really good fit for this role, because they see people being pushed to apply for any job going. And what if we could get to a place where the job centre instead was like a gatekeeper to this huge resource of potential employees and could play a role in like pushing up, you know, restricting access to that resource and saying, well, only good employers are going to get access to that. And, you know, supporting people into better jobs is about a change in kind of culture and approach in job centres, but that is intrinsically linked to conditionality. So the Institute for Employment Studies report that came out this week talked about moving away from a model where you're focusing on like, you have to be seeking work for 35 hours a week, you have to account for what you've been doing, and moving towards a much more like open relationship where you trust people a bit more to do what they need to do to get good jobs. And then finally, this point about the adequacy of support and the fact that it doesn't often get mentioned in this debate about moving people into good work. So first of all, if you spend any time around and supporting people who are living on benefits, you'll see that people often struggle to see past the kind of day-to-day struggle of making ends meet, and that has a really limiting effect on people's ability to think about taking a bit of a risk and trying something different. It has like a really chilling effect on people. But it also has an impact on their health, and particularly their mental health. And it gives people very little kind of security to hold out for a better job or to think about how they might retrain or gain skills to get a better job. Obviously, the inadequacy is compounded by things like debt deductions, two-child limit, benefit cap, and that not only breaks the link between need and support, but it also means that people lack this fundamental sense of security of knowing there is like a meaningful minimum floor, an essentials guarantee or a minimum income guarantee that they can't fall below. And then finally linked to that, for people who are on out-of-work benefits because of disability and health, the stakes and the risks are so high of, you know, you reach this place of some kind of security and the prospect of like foregoing that or risking that in order to try to move back into work, the stakes are so high at the moment that a lot of people just can't face that, taking that risk. So we need to find a way of making that a much less risky process, but also finding ways to reach out to people and engage with people on much more trusting and reassuring terms. Because I just think otherwise, that caseload, as IPPR's kind of forecast this week, right, is just due to rise and rise and rise, and the costs associated with it are eye-watering. But the risk is that we return to kind of the old levers of, well, let's tighten rates, let's tighten assessments, let's crank up conditionality again, which is what the DWP has always kind of gone back to over the last 15 years. And I think we have to be brave enough to take a fundamentally different approach.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, let's hope for a different approach this time round. We'll move on to our next speaker, jumping around a bit. So Sarah, would you like to take it?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Lambert and I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns at Gingerbread, the single parents charity. And we've just launched a new report called They Are Sanctioning the Children. It should be on your chairs there. And that's part of our Support Not Punish campaign, which is calling for reform of the social security system. Many of the same themes that Tom was talking about, so that it's no longer hostile and confusing, that it provides a genuine safety net, whilst at the same time also ensuring that single parents are supported effectively at the job centre and elsewhere to find fulfilling work that enables them to support their families financially, and that's what single parents tell us they want to do. Single parent households are almost twice as likely to be living in poverty as those in coupled households. And official statistics showed that in as of February 2024, as many as 1.9 million single parents were on universal credit. When we know that where we know that the majority of single parents are in work, that just shows how important universal credit is, and the support system around it is making sure that that works effectively to help ensure single parent households can be lifted out of poverty and supported to thrive. So this isn't just about people that are out of work, it's also about kind of those already in work and who want to progress in work. And indeed, if the government is serious about tackling child poverty, as it says it is, it's very important to put the needs of single parents at the heart of any strategy as they take that forward. And universal credit reform is going to have to form a central part of that, and it's very welcome that we've heard from the government that there is to be a review of universal credit. At Gingerbread, as we started to look at the different challenges facing single parents when it came to the use of universal credit, we could see that there were clear statistics showing that those with caring responsibilities were much more likely to be subject to universal credit sanctions. That is having their payments stopped or reduced because of not following a particular rule, such as not being able to attend a meeting at a job centre. And we hear regularly, that there are issues with childcare for single parents, whether or not that can be a real challenge in terms of going to some of those appointments. And statistics from Citizens Advice show that 2/3 of those experiencing a sanction had some form of caring responsibility. At Gingerbread, we're also very aware that single parents are much less likely than other groups to have any kind of buffer or savings to fall back on, and are much more likely to be in debt than others. For many, separation or divorce can be the cause of that debt, with our research showing that 44% of single parents with problem debt cite relationship breakdown as the cause of that debt. So we knew that the reduction in income that can result from a sanction has the potential to be absolutely devastating for a single parent family who will have little to no savings and who may already be in significant debt. So with the support of the Lloyds Bank Foundation and with our partners Home Start, Lambeth and Himmer, we carried out focus groups, interviews and surveys with single parents, as well as looking at official statistics and existing research to find out kind of what was happening with the sanctioning regime for single parents. And in a moment you'll hear from single parent Faith about her experiences with universal credit, but I'm just going to run through our key findings for you now. A key finding that won't be news to the panel and many in the audience, as countless reports have found similar, was that the way that the sanctions regime works has created a hostile environment for single parents. People told us how they were made to jump through hoops and had unrealistic expectations placed upon them. We heard from a single mum who'd been forced to go to the appointment just after she'd given birth, just to be told that she didn't need to do anything. Others told us that specific requests for specific paperwork, some of which had been previously provided, as well as the tone and approach to ask for specific forms and proof for certain things was causing significant stress and anxiety. Single parents told us about the lack of flexibility and grace in the system to take into account individual circumstances. According to official statistics, the most common reason for a sanction is for failure to turn up to a job centre plus appointment, and single parents told us of the challenges of managing childcare, and the rest of the juggle that happens when you are parenting alone was causing a lot of this. And many also told us that when they were able to challenge that sanction, it was overturned, showing that actually it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but actually all the undue stress was caused as a result of that sanction. And as Tom's alluded to, wider research shows that sanctions are ineffective in getting people into work long term. And also, you know, you're talking also about that any job first approach and the impact that can have. And we know that often those who've been sanctioned are more likely to go on to those unsuitable roles and then fall back into unemployment. The single parents we spoke to also highlighted the impact, as Tom was explaining, that this hostile environment had on the relationships they had with their work coaches, feeling like that those they go to see in the job centre are at best kind of checking their homework, or at worst just trying to catch them out, is not kind of a supportive approach when you're trying to kind of work with someone and get them to help you into work. What a wider research shows is that the importance of bespoke, personalised support to help single parents find the right work for them is something that can really work. And on a positive note, it seems the government, you know, is listening, and we've heard that there are those plans to reform job centres and really look at the roles of work coaches and having job centres being that central place and much more focused on support rather than being punitive. Our ask would be to also look at some of the very good evidence there is from the last Labour government, from the New Deal for lone parents, and ensure that there are work coaches with a very specific focus on the needs of single parents who often have very sort of bespoke needs, and really being able to understand the challenges that they face is really important to single parents. It's also our view that sanctions themselves need to be abolished, or at the very least only used in the very exceptional circumstances. They don't help people find good work, and they do contribute to making the experience of being on universal credit hostile and punitive. We need a system that creates a genuine safety net and supports, not punishes single parents to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks very much, and as you say, amazing how with such a thin evidence base we still have a policy of sanctions in the DWP. So now over to you, Faith.
Oh, thank you. Hi, so I'm Faith. I don't know if okay, thanks. Yeah. I'm a single parent of 2, and I'm also a gingerbread parent campaigner. And I had a personal story about being sanctioned and how it can happen to anyone, however careful you are, however much you check because the board is separate to your email, and sometimes you will get an email saying you have a message, check your, and what happened was that the time that I was supposed to have an appointment was the exact time I was actually going to be traveling back last year. Fortunately, rest his soul, my brother was going to be buried back home in Africa. And the same day I even had a doctor's appointment, I got my doctor's appointment, and now when I thought I was going to have an appointment with my work coach, it's all of a sudden said, oh, it's cancelled. There was no reason. So I was like, well, is this a robot? Because normally I always get a message from a work coach saying whatever's happened, or your work coach not in, we'll contact you at such a date. Nothing. So I thought, okay, let me just travel. There's no one to get even hold of anyway. So only to return 1 week later, because it was a very short stay. All of a sudden I opened my email, and it says, oh, we got a message, and I looked, and then it said, oh, you didn't turn up to meeting, which was put 2 days later. So I was thinking, this is very cruel. You've cancelled one, and no message, and then you're telling me that you put another one. Usually when they put it, they say check the date, because it could be, they know that I have kids, So it could be I can't make that date for whatever reason. They didn't do it this time. And I was just thinking to myself, no, this is bad, because that means, when the universal credit comes in, I won't get paid. But lo and behold, for some reason, I also had a health assessment when I was coming back. So that was what saved me to not get the sanction, because you don't know how it affects you, because literally if you don't get any euros credit and you know you have bills to pay, it will really, wreck your whole kind of, your planning of things, and you'll just spiral back into debt. You're already in debt, you spiral back into debt. So I'm not just like an anomaly. It's for some people it's much worse. I mean, Sarah did say about someone had to actually go after having had birth, and you feel sometimes that, okay, it's not necessarily that, as much as I want to go back into the workforce, but you feel sometimes it's like, I am the problem. I'm not the solution, I am the problem. And it really, it's disheartening how it works. There should be a better system. There should be always a personal note of some sort, because that's what that job board is for, to write whenever there's something. I always even update them. I've done this course. I've finished that one. I've got maybe this internship. But this time around, it was just like a shock. And you can only imagine the rest. If you read you'll read it, and you won't believe most things you read, but really and truly, the research which went into it was all hearts, really. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sharon. Ashwin.
Okay, thank you. Some of what I'm going to say will echo points that others have made, so I'll try not to dwell on those points too much. But I think I want to just sort of start off by kind of reflecting on why we have got to where we have in employment services and the DWP over the last however many years, 14 years or so. Essentially, the underlying kind of narrative is one of the essential fecklessness of anyone who's in the position of not having a job, and that this kind of narrative dominates the attitude to people, both in the design of rules and the way people are treated in individual circumstances. And so there's an assumption that what you need, the kind of algorithmic kind of derivation of, a failure because somebody has missed a meeting, without actually having the care or the concern to think about personal circumstances or to allow for reasonable systems for proper engagement with people. And that fecklessness in terms of policy is manifested in policies that assume that you could cut benefits effectively to starve people into work, or that you should demand of them that they take any job that's available, regardless of whether it's suitable for their future career. And that, of course, the 35 hours that the Commission on the Future of Employment Support, I was a commissioner on that, Tom mentioned, recommended abolishing immediately. But this is the idea that you have to demonstrate in your meetings with the work coach that you've spent 35 hours looking for work. And of course, we know the results of these. The cuts in benefits didn't lead to more people going into work. It led to more people going to food banks. The notion of any job, well, we have the highest in-work poverty that we've had for many, many years. And people are going into jobs with little prospect of progression, as Tom mentioned. And the 35 hours culture creates the tick box culture, whereby people are spending their time with job centre staff, accounting for their last week and not thinking about the next week and what they could do to improve their situation. So it needs a real reset of both the mindset and the practices at the DWP. And Tom mentioned Katie Jones at Manchester Met, where I am a professor of social policy. Katie and I have worked together very closely for a number of years. And one of the impressions that we have in recent, particularly sort of post-election, but even before the election, is that many of the operational staff actually get it because they see the reality day to day. And many of them have participated in pilots. For goodness sake, the DWP does so many pilots that give them evidence of better ways of doing things and then don't implement them. But they've seen pilots and they've worked on kind of better ways of engaging with people. But actually, one of the problems are the policy officials in headquarters who have both a mindset that has been driven by their contact with a particular set of ministers with some of those attitudes that I talked about at the start, but also a really poor level of evidence base. When you look at sort of some of the arguments for things like the DWP's current intensive work search regime, there's one study that claimed that it increased flows into work, and that therefore if you change from that, it would cost the taxpayer money because people wouldn't be going into work. But it was a limited study in specific circumstances that certainly didn't take into account the wider benefits of actually more human engagement. And that one study, the DWP kind of corporately, and I worked as an economist at the DWP for 9 years, and at the time, I would say this, wouldn't I? We had a reputation of kind of rigor and sort of intellectual depth. And actually, you've now got a situation where kind of officials were stopped from doing analysis which didn't fit ministers' kind of priorities. And actually, the evidence base for this whole edifice is really quite thin. So, but nevertheless, it drives a lot of the attitudes within headquarters policymaking at the DWP. And so I'm very conscious that, that there's a lot to change, but I'm very pleased with the kind of what the government has said about the need for change. But I want to just broaden it slightly. We know about, and the title of today is about the social security system and employment. And we know about some of the effects of trying to force people into any job, forcing them into zero-hours contracts and that sort of thing. But actually, there's a sort of broader point that Tom sort of alluded to, which is the bargaining of low-paid workers and what drives the bargaining position of low-paid workers. And just to give you an example, train drivers' pay is absolutely brilliant these days. And that's because it takes quite a long time to train them. Train companies don't want to spend that money, so they're in a fantastic bargaining position. And so their pay keeps going up, their conditions keep going up. And when you kind of go past like the specifics of employment rights, basically that fundamental about whether you can walk out the door from this job and go to another job is a big driver about how hard your employer has to work to keep you, whether they give you decent pay, whether they give you decent conditions. Well, take the position, who is in low pay? The majority of people in low pay are women, the majority have caring responsibilities, and the majority are working part-time. If you're juggling childcare, you're juggling shifts to fit around your childcare. Well, yes, the supermarkets will offer you shifts that meet your childcare responsibilities, but only on the frontline jobs. The supervisor jobs, you have to work Saturdays. And that we have a sort of situation where if you're on low pay and in those sorts of circumstances, actually the pool of jobs that you can take is very restricted by the people that will accommodate kind of your caring responsibilities. Second, we all know that childcare is a juggle. So what people do is they construct a patchwork out of a bit of after-school club, a bit of grandparents, a bit of either partner, if you're in a two-parent family, juggling their shifts so that one does childcare while the other doesn't. But it's a patchwork, and this is a really complex patchwork to stitch together. That, again, increases the risks and the difficulties and the challenges of moving jobs. So if you're less likely to be able to move jobs, your employer knows that they don't have to work so hard to keep you. Similarly, local transport services, a lot of the low-paid jobs that people do, if you're working in retail, there will be transport going there. But if you're working in, say, social care, often there won't be. And it won't be at the times that your shifts are. So all of this creates this shrinking of the pool of jobs that are available. The consequence of that is a shrinking of your bargaining position and a shrinking of your capacity to be able to say, this employment is rubbish, I'm going to go somewhere better. And in those circumstances, the incentives are not with the employer to improve things. So what do we need to do about this? Well, we need to think about that kind of concept of bargaining in the labour market. We often think about kind of, when we talk about the economy, the government often talks about pro-business policies. But actually, maybe pro-worker policies would improve workers' bargaining position, improve wages at the bottom of the labour market, force employers to look more for productivity improvements in order to pay those wages, and actually have a benefit for the whole of the macroeconomy. So actually, we need to sort of think through, what improves the bargaining position, allowing everybody to go to a job centre for genuine career support, mixing, putting together career support and skills support with employment services, actually that idea of kind of actually thinking about people's careers and how we can support them. And, you know, what is our skills offer for somebody who's juggling childcare and juggling shifts? Well, pretty much nothing. Yes, there'll be adverts on the website of the local FE college, but if you can't even conceive of the time to be able to go and do those courses, actually it's not much of an offer for you. So this kind of, for me, this sort of tackling low pay seriously really does involve talking about some of the DWP services in the way that Tom and others have talked about, but it also means thinking more broadly about people's position in the economy and the labour market and what we can do to be on their side, to give them options. So that all training, for instance, isn't just delivered through the current employer, that there's a training offer that's outside the current employer, because often the way to enable yourself to improve your conditions is to have the possibility of going to another. And so that's what I'd like to see, this broader sense of kind of the social security system helping to address low pay, but also us thinking about the wider set of policies that might make a contribution to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for those contributions. So I will now open up to the floor for questions, which I will take in triplets and give you all kind of an opportunity to chip in on the panel. So I actually hate picking people, so I'm going to try my best. So this lady here on the end, yeah, you, yeah. And then this lady here as well, whilst you're in the area. Maybe this gentleman at the back, yeah, who's just put his thumbs up. Those three. And can you say who you are before you ask your question, please?
Hi, yeah, so I'm Caroline Salmon. I'm from the Public Law Project. We work with Central England Law Centre at the moment, round about supporting people to challenge sanctions, which also stems from previous research that really backs up some of the stuff around about the impact on trust as well. I really welcome the kind of reference from Matthew to kind of restore like the balance and as part of the Universal Credit Review. One of the concerns I have is that whenever it's referenced, it always sort of stops short of kind of the more radical reform or ideally scrapping of the current sanctions and conditionality regime. And I guess I would find it really helpful to understand a bit more, first of all, what that rebalancing looks like in practice, what kind of things does that mean, and is there an appetite within Labour taking into account all the evidence about how the current regime isn't effective to really look at whether it's appropriate and should be scrapped or at least fundamentally reformed?
Hi, Lucy from the Renters Reform Coalition. So we know that one of the biggest outgoings for most households, including households with children, is housing costs, and in particular private rents, which is now at the record high costs for private renters. So I'm wondering, for Matthew, what will the Labour government do to ensure that there is some downward pressure on rents, which are still going up despite going way outstripping wage growth? And also, for the rest of the panel, what should the Labour government do to make sure that housing is affordable and isn't eating up these massive chunks of people's incomes and making it really difficult to afford other essentials?
Hi, John Andrew, Head of Public Affairs at Rethink Mental Illness. Obviously the work capability assessment has a lot of problems in general, but when it comes to mental health, it's kind of particularly disastrous because the way that the work capability assessment seems to function and the questions they ask doesn't even seem to have been done with mental illness in mind at all. And the people who interpret it quite often have no understanding of mental illness, to the point where we've had beneficiaries told they're fit for work because, quote, they were not rocking backwards and forwards. So some really kind of horrible, kind of baked-in problems there, which creates issues of trust. The previous government they were booted out of office before they actually got to do it, but had this whole plan around back to work, which Mel Stride was leading on, which included a lot of measures in particular which were targeting mental illness and trying to put more people who were mentally unwell back into work when they weren't well enough to do so. Which has actually created more issues of trust, and we haven't had kind of anything cast iron from the new government yet, which is understandable. But you know, we would like something saying that they're not going to follow through with this plan. But more generally, how can this government make sure that mental health, in particular, is looked at in relation to the work capability assessment, because the lack of trust is particularly acute in that area? Sorry for the rabbiting on a bit, but thank you.
Cool. Okay, so we've got 3 pretty hefty questions there. So one on sort of the balance between, what it means to rebalance conditionality in the sanctions regime, another on how we deal with pressure on rents, and then the other on WCA reform, in particular with respect to mental health. I'll let you go first, Matthew.
Thank you very much.
With those 3 small questions there.
Tiny questions,
Yep.
easy to sort out. Thank you. I'm so sorry I didn't catch your name. Caroline. Thank you, Caroline. So I know I mentioned before there's a review happening currently into universal credit, and I think a lot of the detail will need to come through that. So I can't preempt that. So I just wanted to kind of put that up front and centre. But in terms of what I think the change looks like and whether I think we have the right ambition to really to scale up to the challenge of the scale of the problem, I guess I would say this, but I totally do think that. I think we've been in opposition for 14 years, looking at failed project after failed project. Ashwin mentioned all the pilots that have gone forward, some showing what actually can work and not being taken forward. And I just want to communicate that frustration of sitting there and thinking, actually, if we could change this, we could shift so many things. And there are some brilliant colleagues that I have who are now sitting in government who have been thinking about this for an awful long time. I think you mentioned before, Ashwin, that ministerial priorities under previous governments have almost dictated how the DWP have functioned. And I think what worries me there is they've also carried through those ministerial assumptions about who goes to a job centre, why they go, and what motivates them otherwise. And from the colleagues that I speak to, from the people I know who are looking and doing this work, I have confidence in their underlying assumptions, in what they want, which is ambition for all people to get into the very best jobs. And they know that a punitive, judge you upon arrival culture just doesn't help you whatsoever. So I think we do have the ambition for that. And I think it looks like, without preempting this, or at least things I would like to see, is that there is more trust, there is more understanding. I think it touches on other questions as well. We need to make sure we're developing that broader understanding of the person as a whole. I think there was a question, did you want me to do all 3 straight away?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Why not? There was a question then on the housing cost. I mean, it won't surprise you, Lucy, that, we made front and centre in our manifesto the ambition to build lots more houses. And I think that's actually a really important step towards this, because if we can build the houses, we can get people out of situations where they're in awful conditions. And I think someone I know right now who rents a flat and feels in quite a precarious position, but the flat is riddled with damp. And he knows that his rights are that he can challenge for that to be done. But his fear is, if he gets turfed out of there, he won't be allowed back in because the rent will be hiked up and there aren't other good places to go. And I think getting people, I think it doesn't help either that if you're in low pay and you don't think you can afford other options on the market. So getting more houses built, which is a driving mission for the government, is a really important step. The rights we're putting forward for renters is a really important step as well. And also those good jobs so people can feel more secure, I'm hoping, can have a really positive impact. And lastly, John mentioned about the lack of awareness of mental health. I think we are developing our awareness substantially, all of us, not just government, of mental health. And I know that it's a great ambition to find that parity in our health service now of mental and physical health. And I think that some of that is going to be societal. But I think with that understanding, if we want the right results, and as I said, the ambition of our ministers is to get people into good jobs that last for them, that work for them, that puts more money in their pockets that they want to stay in. That requires you to understand the circumstances someone's in. That's everything from what are the skills that you have currently to what mental health challenges you might be going through. So without preempting what might come out of the review, I certainly want to see more understanding, awareness and decency in how we deal with people with mental health issues. And I think I don't think you can get people into the right jobs for them, support them into those jobs without that understanding. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go in the order that I went in the initial order. So, Tom, I know you spent quite a lot of time thinking about the WCA, and will it be even with us in a couple of years?
Yeah.
Good question, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on the conditionality question
yeah,
first.
all 3.
Come back
yeah.
to the WCA one.
Yeah.
WCA one. so my kind of intuitive like feeling is to err towards being like, let's have no sanctions at all, right? But we just came through a big bit of research where we spoke to people who are in the benefit system, we spoke to employment support providers, and we spoke to a fairly large sample of the public. And I guess my feeling is that it's politically very hard to see an endpoint where you have nothing, right? You have no recourse to some kind of like mechanism of accountability. And people in the system say there should be that, and you can argue about whether that's a kind of internalized stigma around it, but and certainly the public feel that. But our conclusion was that the public have a much more nuanced understanding and a much more receptive to a kind of nuanced argument around it than you might assume. So the problem at the moment has been that politicians have said, well, the public demands there's conditionality, right? And that is then used as a justification for the current application of conditionality. And what we've been saying is, you can have a backstop, and lots of other services, so I do work in mental health services have a recourse to coercion ultimately, right? So if someone is judged to be at a risk to themselves or others, you can have that recourse to detain someone under section. But you'd never go into an engagement with someone being like, you better listen to me or I'm going to section you. It'd be such a, well, A, it would be massively unethical, and B, it would be such an ineffective way to try to engage that person. And I was thinking about what Faith was saying about her experience, right? So, I mean, obviously sanctions are bad in terms of the negative impact they have on individuals, and you know, for that situation it's just stupid. It's just a waste of everyone's time to be taking someone's money away because they missed an appointment, and that kind of petty bureaucratic nature of it. But actually, it's also just not very effective. So if you want to have this idea of people having responsibility, okay, well, give them a system where they can choose a slot that works for them and they can book it and they can go to it. That's giving someone genuine responsibility. Like infantilizing them and being like, well, we're going to tell you you have to do this, and if you don't do it, you get punished. It's not even really like it's not really about responsibility. And Harry at IPPR, I can't remember who the work was with, but did some interesting work around thinking about how do we tap into people's intrinsic motivations, right, in public, across the board in public services, but I think it's particularly interesting here. And there's loads of good research that says if you find ways to tap into people's intrinsic motivations for wanting to do things, you can get a lot more out of that relationship than if you rely on an extrinsic, like, threat-punishment relationship. And I just think we're just so uncreative about what that could look like. So there are ways of, like, creating a sense of mutual obligation between people that don't rely on me threatening you, that can rely on us, like, building a relationship, and you feel a sense of mutual obligation because I'm helping you and supporting you. And yes, ultimately, you might then need to have some mechanism that says, well, if this person just refuses to ever answer my calls, refuses to turn up, I've got some mechanism to hold them to account. But why crush the possibility of genuine engagement by, like, going in with that up front? It's like a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's so heavy-handed. So we've been doing some work, and you can look on our website. It's called Terms of Engagement, about how could you do that differently. I think there's lots of scope, but I just think there's a lot of political wariness around it. Sorry, I've talked for too long. Can I say something quick on WCA?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I used to work at Mind and was involved in, like, multiple iterations of independent reviews of the WCA. I mean, maybe we can have a chat afterwards about, like, the ins and outs of it. I guess my reflection, thinking about it now with a bit more distance, is part of the problem is that the exam question for the WCA is really, how much conditionality is it reasonable to apply to this person, right? And DWP comes at a lot of employment support through that lens. Like, we have to establish how much it's reasonable for us, and we're going to assume that we want to apply as much conditionality as possible unless there's reason not to. Whereas I'd say if you start from the position of, like, what's the most effective way to engage this person, and then you kind of defer the conditionality question as far as possible, you just create a fundamentally different interaction and a fundamentally different question for any sort of assessment. So I think it is very tricky, and there's lots that can be done at a technical level, but I think some of it comes back to, like, what's the ethos and what's the kind of mission of the department.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. There, I think sledgehammer to crack a nut characterises many parts of our benefit system. Sarah, go over to you now.
I think Caroline's question was excellent. That kind of, there's a real opportunity for Labour to do something. So can they just be as radical as possible? Look at the evidence that's there. We know sanctions don't work. So, like, actually take the leadership. You've just won a huge election. This is the time when you can make some of those decisions and actually get ahead of what the public think and explain to the public why you're doing that and take that forward. So I think grab that opportunity as you can. In terms of rent, I guess one of the big things is the local housing allowance, and if that can be part of the review of universal credit, because why it would be separate from that review, I don't know. It's part of the social security system, so that would be my ask to government on that.
Great, thanks. Cool. Okay, so Faith, what would you like to see from the government on any of those things?
I mean, I'll just say what Matthew, Tom and Sarah, they put it in a very good way in terms of it needs to be a joint, not even joint effort, but you need to have a joined up thinking, otherwise it won't work, and it has to start from the experience to what can we do for you and how should it work going forward. Yeah, I think you guys summed it up very well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Ashwin?
So briefly on sanctions. So if you look at the data on sanctioning rates, there was a massive spike in 2013. And there was a lot of controversy about it at the time. And then they came down, actually, after that in around 2014-15. And then with the rollout of universal credit, have started going up again. And I remember the government being asked at the time about that massive increase in sanctioning. And they denied that there had been any change in policy. And so what we're supposed to infer from that is that either the degree of, and I use the word in quote marks, I use the word fecklessness not because I think it, but it's the sort of implied assumption, but either the fecklessness of the population rocketed for a short period of time and then fell. No, of course it didn't. Or that actually somehow the DWP civil servants were taking signals from ministers and then took signals from the controversy that this created. And so we had sort of a huge change in the impact of our social security system without any statements to Parliament, without any kind of explicit changes in policy. And for me, this was an extraordinary situation that you could have that much impact on people, and yet there was a denial by ministers that anything had changed. And I think sort of there's two sort of points to raise about this. One is that we have not yet had any statistics on universal credit take-up. And I think this is an abject disgrace. I do modelling of the tax and benefit system. It is a bit tricky at a time of transition to work out if somebody's not taken up a benefit, whether it was not universal credit or not the legacy benefit. This is a slightly technical issue, but for God's sake, the DWP had the data to be able to work this out. But the take-up statistics team at the DWP was tiny. They didn't bother because they didn't want to know. And so one of the consequences of that massive spike in sanctioning and the sense that there was a sanctioning culture, even if it actually came down a bit in 2014-15, is I suspect lower take-up and more deprivation of universal credit than would otherwise have been. And so, but the other point, which also alludes to something that Tom, you said the other day, which is that I'm doing a study at Manchester Met, where I'm a professor of social policy, into kind of exactly what what people feel about their interactions with work coaches. But we have very, very little insight into this. And so given that this is sort of, it's a huge amount of government money that's in scope, there's a huge amount of activity, and loads of people who are affected. We just need to understand more about what is actually going on, how people feel about those interactions. Are they supportive? Are they not? And so that we can shine a light on some of these things. And we don't get what would appear from government statements to be accidental increases in sanctions, because I don't believe that was the case. But that was apparently the story at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say, I mean, the kind of increases in the sanctions rate post-pandemic as well are now higher than pre-pandemic. No policy change whatsoever, in theory. It's just, people in job centre have en masse all decided to get sanctioned. Is obviously not a plausible tale. So yeah, just trying to unpick that and get a proper explanation out of the government is tricky. Great, we'll have another round of questions, please. This lady in the purple scarf. Yeah? You lady at the front here. I think this guy in the tie on the end. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
My name's Judith, and I live locally. I'm not from London, so I'll be unusual in this room. It must be full of people from London. I happen to be a founder member of Gingerbread. When there were only 20 of us in the whole country, I was one of those 20. You wouldn't know that. we managed to get the law changed. This was talked with the gentleman at the end from MMU. This is when people did talk properly to each other. They understood the human characteristics. I was able to work with politicians of both Labour and Tory politicians to make sure that that law worked properly in the interests of single parents and their children. It's really important. Now, we are in fundamentally different situations now. Much later in life, and in a different context, I became involved with mental health services and the difficulties that people have when they're involved in mental health services. Do you know about IMROC?
No, vaguely.
You've heard of it. Recovery colleges, which were set up in order to help people with quite severe mental health problems develop their own courses to be able to return them into mainstream life, whatever that meant for them. They were very successful, but then were discontinued when we had COVID. It was an opportunity to axe all sorts of initiatives which were working well. More recently, I've been involved with open dialogue. And that, at the moment, we're awaiting the publication of the trials of the Odessi work that's gone on with UCL and the psychiatric services in northeast London under Dr. Razak. Again, there is all sorts of opportunities likely to come from that, where people can very quickly, with mental health issues, can very quickly be returned to normal life. And they practice alternatives to medication. Medication may be used, but it's not the mainstream and to go on forever and ever in their lives. The idea is to use it as to cap a crisis and then do away with it, because there are alternatives there in support systems. If you want to know about any of those, I'll be very happy. And if you want to know the history of gingerbread, I know it doesn't know, it's not been recorded anywhere, but I happen to know it.
Thank you.
No, I don't know.
Hi, I'm Jen from Amnesty International UK. We obviously think about social security as it is a human right that the government is signed up to respect, protect and fulfil. And we are starting to undertake research on how human rights compliant our social security system is, with that framing that's often not used in these kind of discussions. The initial conversations that we've had with communities across England, Wales and Scotland so far tell us that actually social security is a linchpin right. It can trigger a domino impact through people's lives which affect all of their everyday rights, including the right to housing, the right to education, the right to work, the right to health, many of which you've talked about today. And we can see some of that impact of kind of siloed policy making on social security, say like the 2-child limit, how that has triggered that kind of domino impact. So my question is this for the government: what will this government do to ensure that protections are put in place so that when social security is being reformed, it does not trigger a domino impact on other rights which people should be enjoying?
Hello, I'm Sam Corcoran, Labour and Cooperative Councillor for Sandbach, Heath and East in Cheshire East. When do you think the 2-child benefit cap will be scrapped, and how should we best campaign to get that done as soon as possible?
Thanks very much for those questions. So on the first point, would you say that was more on comment, or is there like a specific question you would want to have?
I've got a couple of things to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, to reflect on that. We've then obviously got kind of the human rights implications of reforms and future reforms and 2-child limit, which amazingly has only reared its head this late into the conversation. Tom, I'll just one.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for those comments. It's really fascinating. I was going to pick up on the thing you said about open dialogue. So, I mean, this is a thing within mental health services where it's kind of a big shift in like the culture of how services, and you'll probably correct me where I'm getting some of this wrong, but a lot of it is about shifting from a model where quite often in mental health services, and I think it is a really interesting comparison actually. I mean, obviously I would because it's my thing, but if you look at how mental health services have evolved, there's been this big shift away from like relying on coercion as kind of a first port of call rather than like an absolute backstop, but also a shift towards trying to give people more choice and control and recognizing that that's not just like an ethical thing, but actually is like an efficacy thing as well. And I think there are lessons to be drawn within social security. So open dialogue is interesting because it's basically, one thing it's doing is moving away from a model where we'll go and see someone, we'll take notes about them, and that person can't see those notes and doesn't know anything about what professionals are saying about them. It breaks down those walls and says, actually, you're a trusted partner in this relationship, and family members and friends and carers, and it brings those people together and tries to offer a much more kind of rounded model of support that isn't like very kind of us and them. It's much more like we're a group of people working together, and I'm sure there's lots more to it than that. That's my kind of loose understanding. But I think we could think about looking at other services and the kind of shift in how those services are delivered and the relationships within those services as a lesson to draw for social security, which links slightly also to the question around kind of rights, I guess, in that I just think part of the problem here is social security and employment support is just seen as fundamentally different to other kind of public service interactions. I mean, other than probably something like probation, if I'm honest. Like, that's probably the closest comparison, which is, yeah, in other services, there's very much a sense of like, we have to deliver a good service and try and engage with you, and if we can't engage with you, like a good mental health team wouldn't be like, well, this person's failing to engage. It'd be like, well, we're failing to find a way to engage them. So it's like a shift in emphasis and responsibility. And I think there's something similar there around like people, it's not seen as a right politically, it's seen as like a privilege to have that money, right? And actually DWP plays such a critical role in people's lives, and there are lots of people who their only point of contact with public services often will end up being, or the kind of, the linchpin one, as you say, will be DWP. And if DWP like cuts off that support for some reason, like sadly, like people do end up dying because they won't have contact with anyone else. And the thing that people will find when they go into that person's flat and find them dead is it will be letters from DWP. So it plays this like central role in people's lives, but the kind of baggage of this very like stigmatized way that we think about benefits and treat people on benefits plays such a critical role then in like flavoring everything else about those interactions. And I think this is an opportunity now with a new government to just step back and think about like what we could unlock if we thought about these things in a different way and had a different relationship with people.
Thanks, Tom. I'll go back to other speakers. If we can be brief because we need to get round everyone. So over to you, Riff.
To be brief, okay, it's not one of my strong suits, I apologise, but I'll do my best.
I'll make aggressive gestures at you.
Thank you. Well, I'll be very brief. Judith, I was just going to say thank you. It's quite amazing that you helped set up Gingerbread, and if you're going to tell the story afterwards, if I have time, I'd love to hear a bit of that. I think we might have met before, but I'd love to hear more on that. That was brief. Jen, so I think you talked about the domino effect of these rights, and I think I first should say the study itself sounds interesting. So I'm sure, as and when you have those results, you won't keep them to yourself. I'm sure they'll be shared broadly and widely. I think you're right about that domino effect and access to support. And if you miss it at one stage, you probably miss it at many others as well. The focus of the government is clearly going to be on delivery, everything from good houses to good jobs, and a reformed healthcare system that can support people at every stage. So that's my brief remark there. And Sean, you said about the two-child cap. This is not something that the Labour Party wanted to do. And we did mention during the general election, I remember in a hustings discussing it with people, to say that this would be the case. So it's not a change of position. That's the position that we did have. But what I would say now, and I said then, but I can say now with a bit more certainty because we're there and we're doing it, is this is a government that is totally committed, as previous Labour governments have been, to reducing child poverty. And the Child Poverty Task Force, I've seen when I've spoken with Liz Kendall and Alison McGovern, I've seen their ambition to deliver as previous governments have done. And I think when you combine the work of introducing free breakfast clubs in our primary schools, that can have a huge impact. I would love to go on longer about the work we're going to do there, but I'm going to be brief.
Thank you for being brief.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, I'd love to come and speak to you, Judith. Thank you for coming along and sharing your experience. Two-child limit, I guess it was remiss of me not to mention it in my earlier remarks. It's definitely a campaigning priority for Gingerbread and a lot of other charities, so we will continue to be talking about it and hope to see it gone very soon.
Faith?
Yeah, echo what Sarah said. I don't know how in our conversation we didn't talk about the two-child limit, but definitely it's one thing that I really hope it will be looked at, because as much as one would think, okay, why do people have kids and why do they have a certain amount of kids? Sometimes relationships break down. We don't really need to go back into how they are not, they can't choose the right partners, because it can just happen to anyone really. But as far as I know, with the Gen Z, really comes back to a human rights thing. They want Labour to look at, you know, the GDRs. What are we meeting? What are we not meeting? And I think also from a standpoint of the younger generation are having to look at not only how can they thrive at work, but how can they support their parents who they know have really suffered quite a lot the last, you know how many years we've suffered. The last 15 years has been hard, and it's now that really like the older Gen Zs have picked up and they said, you know, I know what I need to do. I know how I'm going to do it, and that's really to work hard. So definitely, if the cap could just go, it would make such a big difference. You'd see parents thriving. You see parents actually going back to work because they can afford more. That's just the whole point. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashwin?
So just on the framing of kind of social security policy, one of the things that the DWP has not done in recent years is thought itself as a contributor to economic growth. And actually, the sort of all of the things that we were talking about a better way of the DWP services contributing to better employment. People are in better wages, then they're paying more taxes, their benefit naturally reduces with the universal credit taper, and so there's a fiscal return on kind of being better at supporting people into work. But also there are other things to do with productivity, you know, and to do that there are other ways in which the DWP services could contribute towards economic growth. And so in addition to, or one of the things that we have to change is actually to think about the economic impact of the DWP in addition just to sort of the interaction with individuals and the services we provide to them. On the two-child limit, so I worked in government for many years as a civil servant, and one of the first things that you realise when you're doing policy making within government is that policy making is an ecosystem. There is not one single voice within government that dominates everything. There's one decision at any one point in time, but there's a massive amount of internal influencing and discussion that goes on that contributes to whatever the formal position of government is. So what you can be absolutely certain about is there are lots and lots of people in government that want to get rid of the two-child limit. But there are also people, but the final penholder on this is Rachel Reeves. But Rachel Reeves is not there as some kind of sort of monster wanting to do bad things, but she's also facing tensions between, you know, wanting to seem fiscally responsible to keep her Labour government in power, wanting to kind of thinking about financial pressures, for goodness sake, you know, wanting to, you know, increase spending in other areas, investment on public services. So there are all these tensions in a sense, like a government which is trying to do good is always faced with choices about which bit of good to do. So the second part of your question is really interesting. How do we campaign for it? First of all, don't focus on the moral failings of the people who haven't done the thing that you want to do. Instead, focus on the good that the thing that you want to do can do. And like clearly, you know, we know the analysis. We know the two-child limit is one of the biggest future drivers of increasing child poverty. So kind of focusing on that, but I think also about some of the steps that will get us there. So for instance, when Tony Blair announced the abolition of child poverty in 20 years, that made it a government target to target that sort of, and so that increases the political cost of not doing so. So actually, I know this is sort of sounds like I'm not trying to kick the can down the road, but things like the Child Poverty Task Force that's going on at the moment, their discussion about what the metrics are that they're going to measure their success by actually leads on through the government policy making to go, well, if there's a metric that covers this, then we're going to have to prioritise that one a bit higher up this big load of good things that we want to do. The other thing that kind of gets things pushed up the agenda is the economic consequences. If, for instance, just talking about if actually families are going to food banks or educational outcomes are suffering, being able to identify that evidence actually is helpful in pushing things up the list. So, of course, we want it to go, but there are kind of ways in which you can sort of increase the likelihood of it getting through that massive funnel of good things that people want to do, which frankly compete with each other in terms of money and in terms of government time. And I'm confident we will get there. I would like it to be as soon as possible, but I think it was really interesting that you asked that second part of the question. I think it was really helpful.
Thank you, Ashwin. And yeah, I think if the child poverty strategy concludes that we need to keep the two-child limit, we'll need to think whether the strategy's worked, or we'll need to go back to the drawing board. But yes. That's my view on that. Right, brilliant. Apologies for the people who I was not able to pick for questions, but I will just want to give every speaker a sort of final word, basically, on the panel. So, sort of closing remarks, briefly as well, if possible.
Me?
Yeah, go for
it. Yeah, great. Look, thanks for being here. Thanks for the interest in this. I think it's so clear it's an area of total failure from the last government. I think this has to be something that this government takes forward in an evidence-led manner, because there's no point us thinking we know all the answers, not reviewing the results of the pilots that Ashton had mentioned, not trying to consider the different ways that we can consider mental health, and not doing everything we can. And so there is real ambition, I know, amongst my colleagues in the Labour Party, and I know amongst the government, to make long-lasting and real change so that the DWP is actually seen as a real good supportive network, because when services for the poor become poor services, we can't end up in that situation. So we need to make sure that the DWP is reformed and works for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
I feel like I've spoken a lot. I'm not sure I have anything massive to add, but other than to say, I mean, yeah, really, really great questions and really good discussion. And I guess just, yeah, I feel optimistic that we are at a point where hopefully there's going to be a different relationship between not just, services and people, but also government and all the people in the room that have been doing lots of work on this for a long old stretch, right? Lots of us have been like hammering away at this for a long time. And I think, yeah, as Ashwin was saying, like finding a way for that to be like a constructive, supportive relationship where we're genuinely feeding into something, rather than as for the last 15 years where it felt like a very combative relationship where we're just banging our head against a wall. So I'm hopeful it will be a different relationship, but I hope the government takes that opportunity to kind of draw on the resource of all the thinking that's been done.
Sarah?
I think what's really heartening is the violent agreement we've had on the panel. I don't think anybody thinks that the universal credit system is working as it is and needs that radical reform, alongside that kind of real, looking at how the job centres work as well. So both looking at the social security system and then also making sure that people can get the support that they genuinely need from job centres, so that they can find not just any old job, but work that's going to be fulfilling for them. And then I guess my plea to government and as, as a backbench MP who can help us get where we need to be is really making sure that single parents are at the heart of the child poverty strategy. We know that single parents are much more likely to be in poverty than others, so the needs of single parents need to be taken into account as that strategy goes forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo what Sarah says in terms of when it comes to the sanctioning and the title of the report, this punishing parents. So I think just like Matthew said here, that Labour is very passionate. They are very passionate, we know that. And hopefully with that passion, just like you're creating roadmaps, and just like Tom, does a lot of research. I love reading his research. I don't know why, but it makes a lot of sense because he always goes back. Yeah, he always goes back to what happened and what is the reality now. And he backs it up with figures as well. And it's very important to know that if we're going to start with, again, a new roadmap, the same thing with the universal credit and sanctioning, we'll probably have to document exactly how is it now. Okay, we have figures maybe going back a little bit, but not enough. So how is it now? And only when you're really sure, okay, you know what's happening in the very deprived areas, then you'll know how to roll out something, nationally. And it has to be, obviously, and we do have Northern Ireland. So let's have the approach that it's not only, England and Wales kind of thing, and Scotland would just manage themselves. It's a whole national approach, and everyone should be on board. And you'll get that support that you really need once everyone's on board, I think. So, yes.
Ashwin, finally.
Thank you. If you think back to sort of narratives, and there's a narrative that people who are not in work need to be forced into work. That's been the sort of narrative that we've seen recently. But one of the narratives that we've had in the Labour Party has been about the need for jobs. And I think what's really welcome is the sort of recognition that it isn't just about the job, it's about a good job. We've seen increasing in-work poverty and actually focusing on the quality of work that offers training opportunities, progression opportunities, kind of dignity, a sense of all the other things that comprised of good work, which a lot of people analyse. I think it's really, really good that we're kind of focusing on that. And that should shine a light on the working conditions of people who are juggling shifts, juggling care, working part-time. Often it's people in those positions where the quality of work is least, and therefore must be our priority in thinking about how we change the labour market and use the social security system to do that.
Brilliant, thank you. So we are at time, so thanks very much to the audience for the questions and coming along. Thank you to the panel for your good answers, and thank you to Gingerbread for partnering with us on this event. I think it's been great. Thank you very much. Thank you.